Hello, everyone. My name is Janelle Sainabin, and I am a teacher librarian with the Peel District School Board. And I also sit on the Book and Periodical Council's Freedom of Expression Committee. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the BPC's Freedom to Read Week interview with host Avleen Dhaliwal, who is a student in grade 12 at Louise Arbor Secondary School, where she is the SAC and DECA president, and our 2023 Champions of Free Expression, Jessica Kim and Spencer Eisen. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to start the session by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. Even though we are meeting on a virtual platform, we must acknowledge the importance of the lands on which we call home. And we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. If you don't already know the origins of the land you live on today, we encourage you to visit the website nativeland.ca to learn more. Before we begin our interview, let me tell you a little bit about the BPC, Freedom to Read Week, and our Champion of Free Expression initiative. The Book and Periodical Council, BPC, is the umbrella organization that brings together a diverse range of organizations that support the written word sector in Canada. The BPC runs many programs and services on behalf of its members and the publishing industry. You can check out our website, www.thebpc.ca, to learn more. Since 1984, the BPC's Freedom of Expression Committee has been organizing Freedom to Read Week. It is an annual week-long campaign that encourages Canadians to think about and reaffirm their commitment to intellectual freedom, which is guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Despite having strong traditions of free expression and free inquiry, Canada periodically faces threats to both. The freedom to read, write, and publish is crucial to the health of literary arts in Canada. And every year, Freedom to Read Week draws attention to how that freedom can be stifled. As part of its programming each year, the Freedom of Expression Committee chooses a champion who has devoted time and effort to defending or promoting free expression or the freedom to read in Canada. For its 2023 celebration, the committee chose two student journalists for the first time, Spencer Eisen and Jessica Kim. Both attended Eric Humber Secondary School in Vancouver. Let me give you a little bit of background information on their story. It's a good one. In 2021, students said that school officials attempted to censor their newspaper, The Griffin's Nest, after student journalists attempted to publish an in-depth news story that criticized the policymaking of the Vancouver School Board. Editors of the newspaper, Jessica and Spencer, fought against this censorship, and in 2022 they prepared a bill, the Student Press Freedom Act, to protect the interests of student journalists in British Columbia. They sent their bill to David Eby, BC's former Attorney General. They hope the legislature will enact the bill into law. They received support from organizations such as the Canadian Association of Journalists, BC Civil Liberties Association, and the Canadian Youth Journalism Project. They are the 2023 Champions of Free Expression. Despite facing many challenges, these brave champions were selected for their willingness to fight for student press freedom. They are inspiring role models to others who find their freedoms challenged, yet also find the courage to fight for those freedoms. Without further ado, here's our conversation with Avleen, Jessica, and Spencer.
So hi, Jessica and Spencer. My name is Avleen. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a grade 12 student at Louise Arbor Secondary School, and I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation, seeing your experiences and maybe some advice you have for future students. So I'd like to start with a little land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that we are located on the Treaty 19 lands, signed in 1818, known as the Ejete Treaty and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and is also on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat nations. We want to move forward with the spirit of reconciliation and support First Nations by being responsible stewards of the land, that is, to care for the land we occupy. And further, we want to acknowledge that Caledon, Brampton, and Mississauga are home to many Indigenous peoples today. So do either of you have a little land acknowledgement you want to do?
Sure, I'll offer the, so Jessica and I are both from Vancouver, British Columbia, and we both grew up on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Coast Salish people.
Okay, thanks so much, Spencer. So my first question is, just to tell us a little bit about your background and how did you both end up working for your student newspapers?
Yeah, for sure. So our school has actually had a student paper since 2012. So I personally joined when I was in grade 10, and Spencer when he was in grade 8, so a little bit earlier than me. But I think the initial pull to student journalism was both of our interests in like kind of social studies and current events and how that could come to fruition in a school setting and in a more hands-on way.
Okay, thank you very much. Spencer, is there anything you'd like to add, or did Jessica basically cover it?
I think she summed it up well. That was my where my interest came in as well. I mean, I grew up watching CNN and reading Wikipedia for fun, so journalism was a pretty natural place to find myself in when I got to high school in 2017.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. My next question would be, what would you personally like Canadians to understand better about the role of student journalists and why it's so important?
Good question. Spencer, do you want to start?
Oh my God, so many things. Well, firstly, I think that it would be fantastic for Canadians to understand generally just how important journalism is like extremely fundamental to our democracy. So one of my AirPods just fell out there. It's okay, we got two. Journalism is very centrifugal to the functioning of our democracy, and particularly for student journalists. I mean, if we want to view our schools as one of the purposes of them is to prepare students to engage in our democracy meaningfully, they have to be operated in a manner that reflects that. And student journalism is one of the mechanisms that we can achieve that. It facilitates the accountability of school officials. It facilitates the access to information about community events. It gives a quality source of information for students, parents and guardians, staff to rally around. So it's really a focal point of everything important and informative in the community, and it needs to be protected. In order for it to actually achieve all of those goals, we need to afford it the maximal amounts of freedom so it can do its job, free from interference and actually, work in the public interest and the interest of the community.
That was a good
also.
No, sorry.
I was just going to add, kind of the media landscape in Canada is changing. Student journalism is often a really great way to fill news media deserts where maybe there isn't as much coverage that is localized and focused on, municipal politics or like school ongoings. And so like one thing for all Canadians to remember and really reflect on is the fact that student journalists are real journalists. And that's something Spencer and I like to say a lot, in that the work they do is no less important than their professional counterparts.
I think
we'll credit student journalists or real journalists to the Canadian Association of Journalists, who's the first one to promote that.
Okay, thank you so much. And considering how important student journalists are and journalism as a whole as an industry, where do you feel like there should be limits for students and press freedoms, if there are any?
Interesting question. So, I mean, I don't think either Jessica and I are advocates for absolute freedom of expression. I think we do recognize that there are limits to it, and consistent with what the Supreme Court of Canada has said in numerous rulings. We have provincial human rights codes that prevent harassment or discriminatory publications on the basis of certain grounds. We have something similar to that at the federal level in the criminal code. regarding public incitement of hatred. So there are limits to freedom of expression like that exist in the law. I think the place of departure is always that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in public schools does protect student journalists' right to freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Where it needs to be limited, it's essential that school officials turn to Section 1 of the Charter, the reasonable limits clause, to ensure that whatever limitation they intend to place is one that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And the Supreme Court of Canada hasn't given us any comment on what rights to freedom of expression student journalists can really rely on. We have some indication from the United States that is not particularly robust in its protection and its entire doctrine of supporting freedom of the press for students generally. So there are some issues there. But wherever it's hard to predict what type of expression is limited, especially like in this particular year in 2022, where we've the federal government's been grappling with that issue very publicly for quite a while, as with regard to what people can say online versus offline. So there are limits. There's very clear limits for things like advocacy for genocide. Although I say very clear in idea, very difficult in execution. So there are limits, but predicting them is a very lengthy and complicated analysis that we have to work with many other partners to figure out what type of expression should we be prohibiting. But the place of departure is always by default. This is expressive content that needs to be protected, and please tell the student journalists why it shouldn't be, and why that protection is not warranted, and why it should be limited. And type of expression that should always be persistent is expression that is legitimately critical of public school officials. That is the expression that often gets censored the most, but should never be.
Jessica, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think Spencer covered it. Thank you.
Okay, and then just a follow-up to build on that. Do you think there should be different limits in school journalism opposed to journalism in other sectors of the world? If so, why or why not?
I think there are some things about like a school environment that do make the environment different and distinguishable. For example, if you're out on the street, there isn't necessarily a code of conduct that prevents bullying and uses that language. That isn't something that law enforcement typically deals with. We do have criminal code provisions related to assault and harassment, but we don't necessarily have bullying and very specific types of behavior laid out as you might find in like your school code of conduct. Or and there's no like the suspension process is one that is like defined by arrest and detention and the criminal code, not necessarily the more like administrative practices of justice that we see in the school system. So there are differences in what society at large and a school considers acceptable behavior. And I think that's a difficult question because like the courts haven't given us much guidance on that. But I think that and what we've tried to reflect on in the SPFA, the Student Press Freedom Act, is that schools are a different environment than society at large, and that there are different standards for what is required of a school in order to do and conduct its core function, which is learning. It does actually have to be a space where all students can equally access that particular goal. And what an example of bullying, which might be permissible at large in another newspaper, expression that might be if you apply the school code of conduct to the op-ed pages of a national newspaper, could that be considered bullying? Perhaps, but there's nothing necessarily unlawful or actionable about that content. In a school, whatever activity falls into bullying, which would have to be, you'd have to look very closely at what you define bullying as, and whether you're unreasonably interfering with freedom of expression. There are potentially standards where I think we would permit expression outside of a school, but within the school, there are some things that we have to be careful about, and it's very difficult to to use precise language with it, because again, it's like what does that really mean? Like what is the special characteristics of the school? I mean, it's something we know, or we have a feeling about, but it's the precise language is really essential, and so it's why like making general statements is hard, because every expressive content has to be judged on a case-by-case basis, and you have to look very specifically at the meaning of everything, and in the situation actually make a good judgment.
And I was going to say, add just onto what Spencer was saying, that it is particularly complicated when often, you know, those special characteristics could be used to justify or to explain censorship that isn't necessarily reasonable or in the best interests of students and staff and the larger community.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's obvious to anybody who's done any research into either of you or spoken to you that you're very passionate about this topic. However, why did you feel that it was so important to get involved in the issue of censorship at the newspaper?
Oh my lord. Jessica, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I think we didn't necessarily plan on getting involved to the degree that we are, but it all kind of started when Spencer and I and the rest of our editorial board kind of repositioned the paper and refocused it to focus on, or to look at two main things. One, the dispelling of mis and disinformation, and then two, holding power to account, and also giving a platform for students to voice you know, their opinions. And so when we shifted to focus on those two things, that's when we kind of ran into some issues and oppositions, which Spencer can quickly talk about.
Yeah, sure. So the first issue that came up is we wanted to write an article about QAnon spreading in our school community, and when we submitted it to a school official for review, the objection was that it might offend parents who supposedly followed QAnon, that we refer to it as a conspiracy theory. Not a great reason. Kind of distorts the facts to appease community members. Not in line with journalism, obviously. So that was the first thing. The second thing was we did an article about how students and teachers experienced the quarter system, which was a scheduling system designed around the 2020-2021 school year here in Vancouver and the Vancouver School District. It was pretty unpopular, and that's what our reporting found. The school officials were uncomfortable with that, because it looked like our school as a unit was criticizing and in conflict with the rest of the district management. Also not a great reason. Doesn't really remove the idea that students and teachers had real concerns. Our journalism was sound and it needed to get out there, and it was in the public interest. Eventually we did get it out. And then the final straw was in I think the spring, April and May of 2021, when we reported on student involvement in district decision making at large. And what we found was students did not feel they were being consulted very well, and teachers expressed a similar sentiment. And when we asked for the school district's comment on it, they forwarded our email to our principal and essentially arranged for the paper to be stopped. We actually filed a freedom of information request a little bit ago, and I finally got the records in, where we've got school officials congratulating themselves for having stopped the presses in emails to each other. It was pretty terrible to see. But after that, and after getting the Canadian Association of Journalists and British Columbia Civil Liberties Association to help us out and secure publication, Jessica and I decided that this is, we've had enough of this. This is ridiculous, and it's blatantly violates the principles of our right to freedom of expression and freedom of the press. That not one of the objections we experienced throughout the year was ever rooted in our journalism. It was always it's making people in power uncomfortable, which is the intent of what we're doing. To an extent, and how they react to it, they can choose to react to it in a very regressive way and say, don't publish this again, or they could choose to do something meaningful with it, like incorporate it into their work and use it and see it as a positive, much like the way students get report cards. Educators could view journalism, good or bad, as a report card on what they're doing in a very contextual manner. So that obviously that version of taking up what we were doing was not accepted, and that's why we decided that something needed to be done. We looked south of the border and saw the United States had, at the time, 15 states, now 16 states, passed a law, or a variant of a law that does what we're trying to do. So I think Jessica and I just decided that something needed to be done and that we were going to attempt to do it.
And I think also one thing that began as a theory and kind of we realized very quickly was true, was that we weren't the only ones who were experiencing this as students. And actually, as you know, our stories become more public and we've started talking to more student journalists, we've spoken to many about their experiences, and this concept has, and our experiences in particular have really resonated, and it's really come to light how much we do need protection for student journalists, and how many different ways school districts or school administrators can work to censor or suppress freedom of expression in schools. So even beyond things like newspapers, we've had, you know, people talk to us about their student councils, and things not necessarily the exact same, but still very similar in concept.
Thank you. You both mentioned multiple instances where student journalists have been controlled. So I was just wondering, why do you think that students in particular are being controlled and censored in this manner?
Students are like able to be controlled in this way because, I mean, there's a lot of factors, but I think the easiest one to point out is that there's a power dynamic, and that creates, you know, a situation where a person in a position of authority is exercising some form of authority over, you know, another, and it's a different dynamic than we see with the press at large in this century. It's not necessarily like Ottawa at this point can call up any newspaper and say, don't run this story that makes us look bad. That's, you know, we have a framework of jurisprudence and a constitution that kind of protects that, and we do have that sort of at the school level. The constitution, you know, doesn't mutate itself depending on what level of government you interact with, but at least in textual form, in interpretation perhaps. But when in a school, where you've got a principal or someone who essentially controls, you know, the executive, legislative, and judicial functions of a school community to an extent, it's an incredible amounts of power to, and it gives the perception to some administrators that want to act quickly, perhaps, to prevent a story that might make the school look bad, whatever that means. It's in the eye of the beholder. It creates a situation where there's a perceived empowerment to censor, which shouldn't exist and really doesn't exist. It's a bit of a myth that's been constructed with the way student media works, especially in public schools where that the charter rights still apply. And that isn't forgiven by the fact that there's like a school act, or I think in Ontario it might be called the Education Act, and that those laws are all subordinate to the charter, as the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association very disappointingly had to tell our school districts. So it's really the power dynamics that are very unique to student journalism, where you've got students that are, as journalists, communicating with with a source. They're in that context, with wearing that hat, they're theoretically equal, but in practicality and in wearing their other hats as student and administrator, there is a differential that can't really be ignored there.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll be completely honest, I did some research about both of you to get prepared for this interview, and there's one thing one of you said in particular that really stood out to me. I'm not sure who it was, but one of you said that students are not respected as citizens. Could you explain what you meant by that statement and what you were trying to convey to the audience?
Spencer, was that you?
Was that me? I was going to say,
I think it was Spencer, but I'm not completely sure.
That sounds like something I would say, but I also can see Jessica saying it. That's a difficult one. I thought we usually have very distinctive speech patterns. I think both of us know what that means. I mean, it's a Jessica, you can jump out on this too if you want, but it's whatever one of us meant by that is that students and youth particularly are not necessarily valued in their contributions, and that's similar to what we were just talking about, the power dynamic. kind of what gives weight to that is the idea that this journalism isn't valuable, and there's no this particular reporting cannot be of use. It's produced by students. What are they capable of? It's this very like antithetical notion in terms of what we're trying to do with education, actually, that because students are of a certain age and of a certain maturity or of a certain state in their journalism, or phase in their journalism, that they aren't capable of producing things that are meaningful. And I think that student journalists across the country are routinely proving otherwise, and combating that stereotype. But I think what we meant by that is that they not only is their journalism not respected, but not in terms of enjoying all the rights that citizens do generally, and all persons in Canada enjoy under the Charter. That we schools don't necessarily respect those charter rights, and contrary to what the Supreme Court of the United States had a good line about it. I forget which justice wrote it, but they wrote in long time ago that students don't shed their rights, their constitutional rights, at the schoolhouse gate. But schools seem to act as if that is the case, and I think that's what we meant by that.
Okay, thank you so much. So while doing this research, I was extremely impressed by how you guys never stood down, and how you went against all these people who had so much power, especially as students. These are people who have a lot of power over you and affect your life, and your entire future. So I was just wondering, were you concerned about repercussions or backlash from the administration and or adults who you felt should have been encouraging you to challenge the status quo?
Yes. That's the short answer. I think in the moment, it was a matter of necessity, in order to advocate for ourselves and in order to produce the good ethical journalism we were doing. But I think all our actions don't adequately, at least for me, I think Spencer would agree, the personal impact that level of censorship and that what you said, the power dynamic and the disapproval and discouragement from people who we look up to, teachers, but also administrators and people who do to some extent have their actions do have implications on your future. Spencer, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, I always framed, for my job, I always framed what we were trying to do is, and what we were coming up against was a matter of newsroom security, is whether or not our team was safe to do their work from interference from others who, quite frankly, I mean, you might respect in so many other instances, but on the subject of freedom of expression, respect for freedom of the press and journalism generally, I was in my official role very confident in saying no, I'm not interested in this nonsense. But I think it's also that's not easy for anyone to do, and it's not necessarily this idea of like the emancipating like editor who freed their student journal, their team from a overbearing school official isn't necessarily something that can be realized in every school. And there are it's a very individualized thing if someone has the ability to do that with many external factors affecting that. And I think another thing is like it did affect us, and the effect of having to do that, even if we were able to do it, that personal circumstances that facilitated that might not exist for someone else, and no student journalist should have to become their own full-time advocate like that anyway, which is why the law should be there to do it for them. So this situation can be minimized as much as possible.
Okay, thank you so much. So as two students who have gone through this and experienced a backlash, what advice or lessons have you learned that you'd want other students who are in a similar situation and have all these barriers around them and people who are actively trying to stop them? What would you tell them? Or what advice would you give them?
I would say one thing that's very difficult to realize in the moment is that you aren't the only one who's experienced this or is experiencing this. I think it's really easy to feel like you're the only one who's kind of fought this battle before. And I think realizing that can make it more empowering, if that makes sense, to stand up. And I would encourage anyone, if they are experiencing censorship, to see what resources are available. We're always one, but also there's a number of other organizations that we're very grateful have stood behind us, and I know they would do the same for other student journalists. Spencer?
Yeah, I think there's like three little things like under that umbrella Jessica gave that to consider. I mean, one is that, again, student journalists are real journalists. The journalism is best done when it is like not interfered with, and that is actually journalism. It requires independence. So that's the first thing. Student journalists are real journalists. The second thing is that the charter is real. Wake up call to school officials. It's there. It does apply to schools. You do, if you're in a public school, you do have these rights. You do actually have a right to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, specifically in section 2B of the charter. And if you want to get specific, you can see how it applies to schools by going to section 32, 2B, and all that. That right is there. And then the last thing I would say is that a phrase I really don't like is life's not fair. I cannot stand that phrase. In me, hearing that elicits the question, why? Why is it not? And it's not necessarily about entitlement to life always being fair. It's rooted in the idea that an administrative decision maker, a statutory decision maker, which is which is to an extent a teacher and what a principal is. They should be able to answer for themselves, and there should be a culture of justification for their actions. So if you're a student journalist and you're getting told, we can't publish that by a school official, and the answer is we just can't. We can't. It's not possible. Why? Says what? I mean, like, and if there's no answer to that, and if the reporting is just about how students are unhappy with the lack of toilet paper in the school washroom or something like that, that's not a good reason. Come on. So I would encourage, which I think is a real story that we reported on once in our school. But the important thing is that if to really learn to question authority, and be respectful, like, why? What is the rationale for this decision? And if the rationale is bad, or in most cases non-existent, other than like it just makes us feel bad, then no, that's not a good reason. And I think that moves the discussion quite a bit by just asking, why.
I completely agree with that. Jessica, you briefly mentioned support, which is something I actually want to build on right now. So who has been supporting you in drafting the Student Press Freedom Act, and how have they been supporting you?
Oh, this is a long list. Well, the very, very first thing I want to acknowledge is that we did not know what we were doing drafting this legislation. Like, if you saw our first draft, it was not good. We both took Law 12, but all respect to the course curriculum and our lovely teacher, that does not prepare you for drafting legislation. So the first thing I want to say is everyone starts somewhere, and the start may be really, really bad. But
no, really, really exceptionally not good, and incoherently legally.
But we've had so many people help us, so many different groups. Spencer, do you want to name all of them?
Oh wow, thanks for that.
Yeah,
I mean, we've had the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, Privacy and Access Council of Canada, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Canadian Internet Law and Public Interest Clinic, Toronto Metropolitan Centre for Free Expression. Who am I missing? I'm missing people. I miss the Student Press Law Center. So many individual advocates, not tied to any individual organization, that have helped this out. I feel like I'm missing quite a few people, but there's quite a few folks in the civil liberties, and particularly freedom of expression, freedom of the press realm, have been integral into drafting this legislation. Every stakeholder we've brought it past has influenced the act in some way. Conversations with student journalists too influence what we put in the legislation and how we have amended it over the time. So anyone who we've spoken to really about the act, any conversation you've had with us has probably influenced the act in some way. But into the advocates and lawyers and academics who've been behind us are just we're incredibly grateful for them putting their time and showing us that student journalists matter to them as well. But there's so many people that have helped us out, and it was just a matter of sending a few emails to start.
Yeah, everyone's been really generous with their time, certainly, and also, their expertise. And I think one thing I wanted to really emphasize out of what Spencer said was the student journalists who are still continuing to do work in their communities and whose experiences have really, unfortunately proved we need the legislation, but also helped us amend it, make it better, and make it more protective for a wide range of different experiences.
Okay, thank you. Were there any teachers who supported you during this journey, whether it's by actually helping with the actual writing of the bill or maybe just emotional support, personal support in any way?
Yeah, I would say, I'll speak for both Spencer and myself, but one teacher who was really influential, even before our investment in the idea of creating this bill, was Miss Romy Cooper. She was our social studies teacher in grade 9 and 10 and 11. And she just taught us so much about being critical and thinking in a way that we were really able to build on, just in terms of even getting involved in journalism and reporting, and then moving into creating legislation. I think that's one of the biggest people, I would say, for me and Spencer. Do you want to shout anyone else out, Spencer?
Yeah, sure. I'll give a shout out to Mr. Pino Scaglione, who was the teacher sponsor for the newspaper. He let us have the wheel for everything. He trusted us, and he had the confidence in us to manage a newspaper that was pretty successful during our time there. And when he was the first person to be like, yeah, you guys seem like you know what you're doing, take it away. And we did. So I'm very grateful that he let our editorial board take run our own newspaper fully independently. And that was a small but massive gesture.
And I think also, there's so many teachers I won't name who shared maybe their personal experience that helped us inform a story, or they let us use their classroom at lunchtime to meet. Things like that really make a big difference. And we're really grateful.
I'm gonna add one more person. The vice principal that we worked with. He was the administrative contact. Absolutely incredible person. We sat on different sides of the table at times, especially in the early beginnings of it. He totally came around, Mr. Dale Ambrose. I'm immensely grateful for his support throughout our time at the paper. He always took the time to listen to us, even though he was an administrator and that made things difficult at times. He always heard us out, and he always was there to listen, and did what an educator is supposed to do, is facilitate learning as best they can. And he I think really embodies how, particularly how we in terms of how we ended things during our second and last year, is pretty much a model for how all school administrators should support student media across the country in public schools.
Also how just adding on to what Spencer said, also how learning can happen on both sides, both for students and also people in positions of power. But yeah, Mr. Ambrose, very lovely.
Well, I'm glad it sounds like you had some amazing people backing you up in your corners, even if it might have been difficult at times. But when drafting the Student Press Freedom Act, I'd imagine that it's quite a commitment. So I was just wondering, what impact did it have on your life, and how did you balance everything? For example, school, social life, a job, and actually writing the bill.
We started doing it in the summer. of 2021. And so I think that made things, I mean, we Jessica and I work in the same place, so we could actually talk about the law like on our way to work and on our way back from work, and like specifically who we were meeting with like after we finished like our shift. So I think that made it easier for us. But into the school year, it was difficult for sure. I mean, there was a lot to do between like our school and our newspaper, and then having and being advocates for our newspaper and all the student newspapers generally. I think that was the very much a challenge looking back on it. For me, the way I managed it was, and I wasn't much of a schedule person. Now I have a calendar for down to the hour for everything. But at the time, absolutely not. And Jessica's laughing because it's terribly ugly in color composition. But at the time, what I did was I blocked off what I wanted to accomplish in one day. And I decided, this day is going to be allocated, or these few days or this weekend is going to be allocated towards this particular mini project or aspect of the work. I'm going to work on the manual at the newspaper one day. I'm going to work on the website at the newspaper one day. I'm going to get articles ready for the newspaper. All right, SBFA day, and we're going to send this many emails to these people this day and respond by this day. That's how I managed it. Jessica, do you want to share about how you did it?
I was going to say, it's really easy for it to seem daunting, but like Spencer said, breaking things down, because obviously it doesn't happen all at once, is something that's really important. And I think something we also did, but definitely could have done more of, is lean on your other peers. We had a wonderful editorial board. Stephen Kosar, Erica Chung, and Hannah Azad were all members of our editorial board, and they did so much. And I think it's in real, even knowing your own capabilities and being able to rely on your peers and people you trust to also do certain portions of work is something we could have done more of, but definitely really appreciated the work of other students as well.
Okay, thank you so much. So during this entire process, personally, what was your involvement in drafting the Student Press Freedom Act?
Well, Jessica and I wrote the original one. That's the start. We wrote is a fun term. We did it on a pages document over 2 weeks, looking at the first one was pretty bad. I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty terrible. But we finally got it to a few people that gave us some feedback on it. And how it generally works is we would send the document around, and this is how continues to work. I think we just did our last amendments a few months ago. We would send a copy around, and people would give us suggestions, and we would be the final ones to decide whether we wanted this or not. And we had a lot of things to consider, and we had a lot of at times competing perspectives. But the way it works is Jessica and I would send this draft around. And with specific questions about sections and all that, and give like a little summary of what we're thinking about it, what we want to do, what we're trying to avoid, and we would get feedback on that. And it was more or less like a very informal legislative consultation where we would look for feedback, and we would amend it or change nothing, or refrain from amending things as required, just by reflecting on what we had heard and then our individual discussions. But we basically just control the keyboard essentially on what gets change accepted or denied, and that's pretty much it. That's a very good summary of it.
Yeah, a lot of long conversations and considerations of if we do this, what are maybe the intended but also unintended consequences, and then what if we don't do something, what will that kind of how will that kind of change things. So a lot of talking as well, and not knowing what to do at times, but figuring it out,
and talking but not knowing what to do.
Okay, thank you so much. So I can imagine it's been quite a lengthy process with a lot of ups and downs. However, can you tell us a little bit about the act and what stage it's at right now?
Yeah, for sure. Spencer, do you want to start?
Sure. So there's a few things the law actually does. Is one, it introduces statutory protection aside from the constitutional guarantee of freedom of expression and freedom of the press. That's the first thing it does for student journalists. Second thing it does is it provides it provides a shield for the disclosure, a necessary disclosure of student journalist sources. So if you've got an anonymous source, if that source is to be revealed, there better be an extremely good and compelling reason to do that. Otherwise, that source has to remain anonymous as pursuant to this act. It's a right that professional journalists only got in Canada in 2017 in something called the Journalistic Sources Protection Act, which we modeled this after. Next thing it does is it protects students, teachers, principals, and I think that any school employee from facing retribution for allowing student media to do its job, and also protects students from facing retribution for doing their job. And last thing is it provides a forum for access to justice and dispute resolution as to if there is something that does where we would like to a school official wants to stop how they do that in accordance with this act, and how they can do that in the way that is most respectful of freedom of expression generally. Because I think what often gets lost is a threat to one student's expression or rights to freedom of expression is a threat to all students' freedom of expression. What we have in the SPFA is designed to allow for a process that streamlines it and makes it very consistent and clear to follow, so everyone knows how we can do this in the most fair way possible.
Okay, thank you so much. So, Jessica, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, just in terms of where we're currently at, Spencer mentioned we're still making amendments and we're still, hearing from other stakeholders about what could make the act stronger, what needs to be changed. So that's an ongoing process that, ever since we started has been happening. And then also we just recently sent a letter to the new Attorney General of British Columbia.
Nikki Sharma.
Yes. As we had a recent change in that position. So hoping to meet with her and talk about where we can go from here, and building that relationship to bring the Student Press Freedom Act to the legislature in BC.
We had met with then Attorney General, now Premier David Eby, back in April of 2022, and former Executive Director of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. It was, consistent with his background. He was expressly supportive of the act and the idea of introducing a legislative solution to this problem, which we were really pleased to see. We've got support from the Green Party of British Columbia and the BC Liberal Party, also now known as BC United because they just changed their name. And we're looking to have the current NDP government, as mentioned, with Attorney General Nikki Sharma being the one to introduce it to the legislature, hopefully next year.
Okay, thank you. So the Student Press Freedom Act, from what you both said, seems that it puts a great emphasis on freedom of expression. So my next question would be, why do you think freedom of expression or having the freedom to read matters so much?
Jessica, do you want to do it or me?
You can start.
Okay. Freedom of expression is, essential to our democracy. And freedom to read as well. It's, freedom to access ideas and consider ideas and share new perspectives. We need that to actually, progress. It's a mechanism for facilitating all sorts of democratic processes. You need freedom of expression to be able to share your opinion. You need freedom of expression to be able to hear others' opinions. It's such an important feature of a functioning democracy that it needs to be treated as is with extreme care, and that's why the act focuses on it so much, and why it's called the Student Press Freedom Act. Is press freedom is the idea that similar to freedom of expression that the press needs to be free from interference and given the maximum independence it can. In order to do its job and share the news and report the news freely without the intervention of the state.
I think you covered it very well, Spencer.
Okay, thank you. So my next question would be, what obstacles have you faced in the entire process? Were there times where you doubted yourself and or what you were doing? And do you have any regrets in participating in this process?
Obviously, obstacles from people who disagree with the extent students should be able to be critical and have freedom of expression in that way, especially in relation to our journalism. We talked a little bit about that already. I think it's drawing and looking at those power structures, it's easy to doubt yourself and kind of question, especially not having any formal training in journalism. We learned from a lot of resources online, a lot of experts in the field, but again, we never went to journalism school and didn't have a specific advisor that had a very, very pronounced journalism background. So I think with obstacles, there was times where we were questioning, is this right? But overall, I definitely do not have any regrets. And am very confident in the changes that need to be made through the Student Press Freedom Act for the betterment of all Canadians.
Thank you.
I think for me, it's one of the challenges is actually getting the attention of lawmakers. We can think this is really important, and we know it's really important, but we just need the members of the Legislative Assembly to also agree with us, so much so that they're willing to actually one, say they're going to support it, and two, actually give it the time of day in the legislature, which is much more, or two different things, and and is more difficult than we perceived originally. But I don't think that's deterring us clearly, and we know it's important, and it's just a matter of getting more people to realize that. And it all comes down to the idea that student journalists are real journalists, and the thing about the schoolhouse gates, they don't prohibit the Constitution's application.
Okay, thank you. I think you've both done a great job in explaining why freedom of expression is so important. However, what are the implications for students and journalists if we no longer have freedom of expression in Canada? Like, what would we see?
Well, for schools, I mean, it's I think right now it's pretty clear. We don't have good data on it because there's no there's no very poor mechanisms for tracking this, if any. But every time that a student newspaper is silenced, unnecessarily and unreasonably, the public interest is damaged a little bit. There is a public interest in hearing the news of the school community. There's important things that student journalists are reporting on that need to be heard, and if that isn't coming out, we're just ignoring problems and silencing people and telling them that their voices don't matter, and we're schooling like a sort of complacency with authoritarianism, in my view, is that we're teaching people to accept the idea that your opinions don't matter, and only the select some opinions matter than others, which is just a profoundly terrible terrible philosophy. But I mean, every time there's a news story that was well reported on and ready and about to be published or about to be put in print, and that's stopped, all the sources are hurt, the journalists are hurt, and the community at large is hurt, because at the end of the day, that doesn't change what's actually written, what the informational value of what was there. It's just a school official decided that we don't want anyone else to know about it, and that often means we're also not going to do anything about it. So it just it does nothing but it creates honestly more problems than it solves. It does nothing except protect the reputation for as long as the censorship can last, I guess, of the person who's preventing it.
Yeah, I was gonna say it just stalls any sort of progress or opportunity for real change, because oftentimes that's something that can be realized out of a story that sources are expressing a certain problem.
Okay, thank you. I think all three of us can agree that it's crucial to protect freedom of expression. However, who or what do you consider the biggest threat to freedom of expression in Canada today?
Oh, wow, that's a big question.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Like to hear us speak a little bit.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, there's I mean, there's a lot of within the free expression camps. There's lots of different opinion opinion settlements, if you will. But I think for me, um, the freedom of expression online and particularly on large private platforms is of great concern. We don't, the charter does not apply to Twitter, although Twitter's new owner has been in recent days been kicking off journalists who are reporting on him and remove. I think yesterday, which was attempted and then walked back, brilliant. Was no accounts that there was you couldn't circulate links to other competing social platforms, which is like insane. So, well, freedom of expression in Canada, we've been talking about it in the sense that, like, the government is the biggest threat, or like the state is the biggest threat. In schools, yeah. As an agent of the state, yes, the principal is the biggest threat. But at large, I think that where we have strong constitutional protection from the government intervening in freedom of expression. On private online platforms where which have become, people like to use different analogies for what the internet is, but like, the new town squares is a popular one. Our digital town square is not necessarily very well regulated in terms of freedom of expression guarantees, and I would think that the biggest threat to freedom of expression in Canada right now, if not complacency and a lack of realization for its importance among the public, is particularly private corporations that operate platforms of this scale and importance, making arbitrary content moderation and other decisions that affect freedom of expression negatively, and that don't actually ultimately support the public interest, or I guess the corporate version of that is corporate social responsibility, to actually protect these fundamental freedoms, regardless of whether you're state or government, your state or corporation.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Jessica, to what Spencer said?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, sadly, I'm down to my very last question. And this last question is, what's next for both of you? You've already done so much, but what is it that you're planning to do moving forward, whether in your personal life or in relation to press freedom?
Ooh, big question. Well, okay, we're both in university right now. I'm currently at the University of Western Ontario, so joining from the East Coast, unlike, my usual Vancouver. But we're both still very involved in student media at our respective post-secondary institutions, but also, leaving high school doesn't mean we're not obviously still passionate about student journalism at the high school level. So I think helping cultivate that in whatever way we can is super important. Spencer, do you want to continue?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like Jessica said, I mean, despite not being in high school, I'm still, I still read my high school newspaper. I still read the other high school newspapers that we talked to when we were editors of, a few months ago. So obviously we still care, and we'll keep pushing till the act is passed. I'm at the University of British Columbia. I study political science and information science. I'm fairly sure I want to go into law. Law is cool. I enjoy it. I like, a lot of things about it. So, to say the least. And then I also am interested in pursuing graduate studies in information science. But something like that. That's my route, more or less.
Well, I wish you both luck in whatever you choose to do in the future. At this point, I'd just like to thank you so much for taking the time out of what I'd assume is very busy schedules to talk about this topic. You guys have given us such great insight into the whole topic. You've answered all the questions beautifully. I couldn't have asked for more. However, I just want to end and ask you guys, is there anything else you'd like to add that you maybe didn't get an opportunity to mention, or any last thoughts?
I'm gonna go with student journalists or real journalists. We've said it like a million times, but I think like if there's one like phrase like that could be put on like a refrigerator magnet, it's that. And I think that would sum it all up.
I'll agree with that. I also just wanted to thank you for all your questions. As
Thank
journalists, we're usually the ones asking. You did a wonderful job.
Flip the tables a little bit.
Yeah, and we really appreciate you talking to us and being so thoughtful, but also questioning us and challenging us to, share certain things.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. I think that's all from me.
Thank you.